Welcome to Family.Inc Expert Interviews. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Ken Hoogstra, a shareholder and chair of Von Briesen's Compensation and Benefits Executive Compensation Section in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Ken maintains an extensive employee benefits practice, advising clients on such matters as ERISA compliance for group health, welfare, and pension plans, and the design and administration of qualified retirement plans and non-qualified deferred compensation plans. Ken places a particular focus on the implementation, design, and administration of employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs, which is why we're here. He's also significant experience working on executive compensation arrangements, including compliance with tax laws, as well as disclosure requirements for executive compensation plans in public company proxy statements and periodic SEC filings. Working with attorneys from the firm's litigation and risk management team, Ken has helped defend employers, retirement plans, and healthcare providers in numerous ERISA litigation cases, both at the federal, district court, and appellate court levels. Ken also counsels both public and private companies on a wide variety of securities laws issues, including compliance with SEC filing requirements and exempt stock offerings. He advises public companies regarding their compliance obligations under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010, and other federal and state statutes affecting companies' SEC disclosures and corporate governance requirements. Ken, thank you for being here.
Hey, Josh. Happy to be here.
Today's discussion is titled ESOPs, Your Other Liquidity Option. Real quick, before we begin, a little housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to your questions. Ken, thank you. ESOPs, as I work with families, family enterprises, the idea of creating liquidity for their organization without giving up control, looking at options, ESOPs is always a good thing to look into. So let's talk about what is an ESOP. What are some of the pros and cons? Let's try to keep it high level, and then we're going to kind of zoom in and try to understand sort of application.
Sure thing. I appreciate that. So I think when we start talking about ESOPs, one of the first things we need to understand is that it is a retirement plan. It's what's called a qualified retirement plan, which means it's subject to the same rules, a lot of the same rules under the Internal Revenue Code as, say, 401k plans. One of the primary things, for example, is that the plan can't discriminate in favor of highly compensated employees. Sometimes what we find is this might be almost the end of a conversation with a business owner who's just starting to understand ESOPs because they're thinking it might be a vehicle to transition ownership to, let's say, a few key management employees. And unfortunately, it's not the tool for that because you do have these non-discrimination rules. It tends to be more of a broad-based plan. And because it's also a retirement plan, you need to coordinate it with other retirement plans like your 401k plan. But, that's, there's not too much coordination, mostly in terms of how much goes into everybody's account in a given year. You aggregate your plans. What makes ESOPs unique, though, when it comes to a retirement plan is that unlike a 401k, unlike most pension plans, an ESOP is designed to invest primarily in the stock of the employer or parent company that sponsors the plan. It doesn't need to own 100% of the employer stock. It could be really any percentage. But when you look at the investment portfolio within an ESOP, usually you're talking about 90+% of the investments in the plan are company stock. The rest is pretty much cash. Yeah. One thing that ESOPs do, though, because they are designed to invest in employer stock, and I think the reason we're here, Josh, is because it does give that liquidity option. It does provide a market for business owners as part of their succession plan, exit plan. And actually, it's a big reason why Congress authorized ESOPs in the first place. Over the years, Congress has actually expanded the availability of ESOPs for S corporations, for example, and now even giving some of the tax advantages in the future to S corps that some of the C corporation owners previously enjoyed, like tax deferral on the gain. That's available for C corp owners, not yet for S corp owners. One last thing before we jump into some of the pros and cons, if that's where you want to go next, Josh. And I think it's important to understand this aspect of ESOPs. As a retirement plan, it is subject to not only Internal Revenue Code rules that apply to retirement plan, but also a federal law known as ERISA. Won't get into all the details of ERISA, that's way too deep, but the primary consideration is that ERISA does not allow an ESOP to overpay for the shares it purchases. Most of the time, an ESOP gains or acquires shares by purchasing them from the outgoing shareholders. But the ESOP is forbidden under federal law, under this law of ERISA, from overpaying or paying more than fair market value. The Department of Labor is very active in investigating ESOP transactions and whether or not the ESOP overpaid. If there's an assertion that it overpaid, it has brought investigations, it has brought litigation at times where they seek to recoup the supposed excess payment from the ESOP trustee, the business owners, or others that were involved in setting up the ESOP. And so one of the things, a theme you're going to hear this morning is that as you establish an ESOP, because of these rules under ERISA, following a proper process is critical. And it usually involves engaging an outside independent trustee who negotiates the transaction on behalf of the ESOP. And process it over and over again. When we talk with business owners, very, very much at the beginning of this, we have to set those expectations very clearly that process is key. In fact, the Department of Labor even has what are called process agreements that they've entered into as settlement agreements with various trustees to say, in the future, this is how you're going to do it. And you're going to negotiate these aspects of the transaction. And again, all those rules apply already to retirement plans in general, but with ESOPs, they become a little bit more intense and much more, in play, because ESOP, you can hear the inherent conflict of interest, right? If somebody wants to
you
set
can
up the
imagine
plan,
sellers, buyers, they're colluding. They're saying, hey, let's inflate the valuation. We're going to pay, this family more for the shares that they're selling essentially to the employees who are net on the downside of that transaction.
Sure.
Yeah, makes sense. Ken, let me ask you a question. Let's go, before we go into kind of pros and cons, let's talk about the structure and what, like, how is it structured? How is an ESOP set up, and how does it interact with the organization? Let's use that to then jump into pros and cons, because I think that'll be helpful.
No, that is very helpful. So again, an ESOP, it's a retirement plan. You have a document that describes the plan, just like you have a 401k plan document, and also a trust. The trust is the legal owner of the shares that are sold or contributed to the plan. And, effectively, your trust is the shareholder or a shareholder of the company, just like any other shareholder. So it's the legal owner. Now, normally in the structure, what you have is you have the plan as the owner, the share. Let's assume a 100% ESOP owned company. You have a single shareholder, trustee, might be an individual, might be a group of trustees, but serving as the trustee. They will vote in the directors, if you will, and the directors run the company just like any other board of directors. So from a governance perspective, you have that same kind of relationship. And the directors have those fiduciary duties to the ESOP. ESOP trustee has duties to its participants. When you're talking about initial structure, I don't know, Josh, if you want me to get into kind of how these get set up in terms of the transactional side. Okay.
I think let's touch on it, Ken, because I think it will, like, if you're watching this right now, I want you to understand sort of the process so you can think through, is this something that I want to pursue, and how would I look at this? So yes, let's go there.
So normally the first step in this process is once the company or business owner has decided to follow this, pursue an ESOP, is they will retain an independent trustee. The trustee then will be the buyer. The trustee has its own, and they are truly third party. These trustees are people who made their business in this space, whether they're individuals or institutions. Okay. And they will then hire their own legal counsel. They'll hire their own valuation firm to do a full due diligence on the company. In the most simple transaction, what will happen at the end of the day is that the company will redeem the shares from the selling shareholders,
Okay.
and will probably either finance that through bank financing or just give notes to the shareholders to be paid over maybe 8 to 10 years or something like that. And then the company will turn around simultaneously, sell those shares to the ESOP, same price,
Okay.
and usually a much longer note, let's say a 30-year note. ESOP puts the shares all into a suspense account. As the company makes contributions to the plan each year, the plan pays back the company and releases proportionate shares, and those get allocated to participants in proportion to compensation, just like a profit sharing allocation to a profit sharing plan. So mechanically, that's how it works. At the end of the day, what you have is you have this financing. The company takes on a lot of debt to finance the transaction. This is, not every situation is identical, but this is probably the main. You have the company taking on, if it's 100% finance transaction, 100% sale, the company is fully leveraged after that transaction. It's leveraged to the full value of the company, if you will, the full equity value of the company.
Sure.
And it will pay down that debt to the selling shareholders or to the bank that financed it over a shorter period of time, like I said, 8 to 10 years. And that's how the selling shareholders get their money, either upfront in a bank finance deal or through these seller notes in a seller financed.
Hey,
There can
Ken,
be other bells and yeah, go ahead.
quick question. The employees, how are shares allocated to employees, or how do they, what is their participation percentage in the ESOP, and how is that determined?
Sure. In most cases, what happens is if you think about a profit sharing plan for a moment, or let's say even maybe matching contributions in a 401k. If you've worked for the company for a year, basically meaning you accrued 1,000 hours of service during the year and you're there at the end of the year, you get an allocation of the company contribution, usually proportionate to your compensation. So if you made 1/10 of the comp of the company that year, you get 1/10 of the company allocation or contribution. In an ESOP, it's similar, but what triggers the allocation is and again, this isn't a finance transaction where you have this, as I said before, let's say a 30-year note between the company and the plan. What triggers the allocation of shares is the plan's payment of its note back to the company. So if you have a 30-year note, and let's say it's 300,000 shares that the plan purchased, 1/30th every year, 10,000 shares are going to get released from that suspense, get allocated to participants, and the number of shares they get in their account is going to be based on their compensation and relative compensation. And so every year, participants will get a statement. How many shares do you have in your account? What's the value of those shares? And that's determined by an independent valuation. And that's over time, that's how their account grows. And again, it's almost entirely stocked, very little cash usually, or other investments in an ESOP.
Fantastic. That's helpful. Let's go pros and cons, I think, both from a company perspective as well as a selling shareholder perspective, if we could.
Sure. So, when I look at selling shareholders, for example, first of all, as I said before, when I start engaging with a company and its owners on an ESOP transaction, I try to set those expectations up front of what to expect, both positive and negative, as they engage in this transaction. Obviously, on the positive side, the ESOP provides a buyer. That's number one. And sometimes we've experienced situations where a company has been trying to sell to another strategic buyer, maybe even a financial buyer, PE firm or something, and they're just not getting anywhere with it. They're not happy with who they're dealing with. And so the ESOP does provide a buyer. It's not an insider transaction, like we said. It's a true third-party negotiation. But an ESOP trustee is not somebody who's coming in to try to break up the company. They're not trying to lose the legacy of the company that has been built up over time. Yes, they're, especially the majority position, they have control over the company, if you will, as the controlling shareholder, but they're not out there to run the business. And so you do have the opportunity, another advantage for selling shareholders, to remain employed or involved with the company. Many times, in fact, an ESOP trustee wants the selling shareholders
Would
to
think.
stay with the company for a period to provide that stable value over
He
time.
risks it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, that's part of we can't overpay for the shares, so we got to make sure this value doesn't tank the year after we buy it. That's the trustee's perspective. So they want some continuity of employment. They would like the selling shareholders probably to remain or serve on the board. I hinted at it before, but if the company is a C corporation, the business owners, if they sell the shares to the ESOP, and the ESOP holds at least 30% of the company's shares after the transaction, the owners can roll over the gain. They can defer the gain on the sale to the extent they get cash and use it to buy what's called qualified replacement property. Won't get into the details on that, but they can do this what's called a 1042 transaction or 1042 rollover and defer the gain on the transaction. Great advantage for them. On the negative side, and this is part of that setting expectations, again, the ESOP can't pay more than fair market value, so it is fully negotiated, and the ESOP trustee may try to negotiate things to help protect the value they get, like clawbacks, or maybe some indemnification provisions if the financials turn out to be inaccurate, and so on. Another kind of negative or con. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question on the valuation?
Yeah.
As I think about estate planning, a lot of families have worked on gifting strategies, obviously, in especially as we lead up to December 2025. So they're looking to gift at the lowest valuation possible to get those shares out of their estate. How does that impact the valuation that they would get in an ESOP transaction? So fair market value, I could see some sort of conflict or friction between what we gifted shares at a year before, and now we're trying to sell them at fair market and might be higher. And there's sort of a gap there.
Yeah, I mean, from a valuation standpoint, no, that's okay. An ESOP, a shareholder who's selling to an ESOP can always sell for below fair market value. I mean, and I don't know, that's not really your question per se, but the ESOP trustee will get their own valuation advisor. They will maybe they don't really share that with the selling shareholders. So there is, again, it's arm's length and so on, true negotiation. Some owners or businesses will actually get a separate valuation to try to determine what they're interested in, or what they might offer, let's say, as an offer to sell. But yeah, I mean, I could see where there could be a dichotomy there if the strategy was to start gifting out shares at low fair market value and then turn around and sell to an ESOP at a higher fair market value. That may not be at that moment the best time to implement an ESOP, just because you will have that disconnect. You'll have that disconnect. Hey, am I really valuing this properly on the gifting side? And you don't want to continue a low valuation. In fact, you may sell the shares at a low value, but you still need to get an annual independent valuation. And if you keep getting lower valuations, you've hurt your participants in the plan.
Totally. Yeah.
So you don't want that either.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Sort of jump down that rabbit hole.
No, that's okay. One other thing I was going to say on the negative side, or maybe two other things real quick, is one of them is transaction costs. I used to put this in the bucket of negatives for the company, but really those transaction costs are being passed through the selling shareholders. So it's really on them. And when we talk about setting up an ESOP, the independent trustee has their kind of base transaction fee because they're taking on a large amount of risk. It's tens of thousands of dollars, to be honest. They got their valuation firm, they got their legal counsel. You've got your own legal counsel as the company. Selling shareholders might get their own legal counsel. I usually advise they do in the transaction. And so there's these transaction costs easily get into six figures quickly, unfortunately. But again, it's a full M&A negotiated transaction. And in a lot of cases, the selling shareholders also just get deferred payments. They don't get cash at closing. Then they can, if the company has some cash, or if the company wants to do bank financing, increase transaction costs, but at least you get cash up front, and you can do the 1042 rollover as a C Corp when you get that cash up front. But But if you're getting notes, you're taking the risk that the company is going to go insolvent, and maybe even more significant, it's even if that risk is minimal, that debt that the selling shareholders get is subordinated to bank debt. It's unsecured. Market rates would be in the double digits on interest. No ESOP trustee is going to pay ESOP, going to authorize the company to pay double-digit interest rate on those seller notes.
Right.
So you're going to get below market notes as well, unfortunately, usually on the interest rate.
So
those
thinking about the financing of this transaction leads to then, who are the good candidates? What kind of organizations are good candidates for an ESOP?
Well, I mean, number one, you want some stability at the company financially over a sustained period of time, some stable cash flow, profits, and so on. It's not that you can't have a cyclical business engage in an ESOP, or a business that's really taking off to engage in an ESOP, but trustees are going to look at that a little more skeptically, as you can imagine. If the cyclical nature of the business is predictable and not too wild, okay, you can maybe accommodate that and get what the buyer or selling shareholder might consider fair valuation. In a kind of a hockey stick situation where things have just taken off, then yeah, again, you need to kind of explain the story as to why that's happened and why it's sustainable. Otherwise, you wouldn't expect to get that value. So there's ways to work with that. I would say, as far as an expected transaction value, probably talking at least 2 million, maybe a little bit less, but it used to be a lot higher, frankly. It used to be, I would say, 5 to 10 million. And I've kind of brought that number down because the number of players in the ESOP market, like individual or institutional ESOP trustees, valuation advisors, and so on, that has expanded. So there's a lot more expertise out there to bring to bear in these transactions, which, it allows some transactions to go through that on a size that they might not have otherwise done that. I would say 25 to 50 employees is probably a minimum number, because we talked, Josh, before about the allocation of shares each year, and you've got to allocate those shares over to your employee base, and you want to make sure you're not allocating too much to any individual in a given year, or that you want to be able to allocate the shares entirely without hitting deduction limits under the Internal Revenue Codes, and that's a function of your payroll size, your U.S. payroll size. So those are some of the things that I look for in the company. From an owner perspective, I tell people all the time, if you're thinking about an ESOP, don't wait till you just before you're going to retire. Do this while you still want to be actively involved in the business. Yes, you will be losing control, at least in terms of shareholder control, but ESOP trustees value that. And so an owner who wants to remain involved with the business is a very good candidate. Willingness to accept somewhat of a conservative price, willingness to go through the process and understand, yes, it's going to take time. Yes, there's going to be moments I'm going to be frustrated with an ESOP trustee, the one that I hired to do this transaction, and so on. And some of the attitude of, do we really want to transition this to employees? That's a little bit looser of maybe a feel thing, but what's the reason for the transaction? And companies that are run ESOPs well are ones that really promote this idea of employee ownership, and employees take pride in that.
I think that idea, the culture piece of this, as I work with families, I often hear about, we don't want to sell to a private equity firm. We want to maintain what we have built, sort of the legacy piece for many, many years. And ESOPs are a great way of keeping that culture and the community and so forth, while also creating some liquidity, which is why it's your other liquidity option is the title of our talk.
Right. Just one other thing that I would say, though, along those lines, about creating the culture, you've got to make sure that the culture is going to be sustainable. In other words, when looking at a good ESOP candidate, also look at who are the key employees that are going to be running the business once the selling shareholder does retire or leave the business. Has there been an expertise that's been developed? Have the relationships been transitioned with key customers, key suppliers, and so on, that will be able to sustain the business when it's not just one or a handful of founders that establish those relationships in the first place. And is management willing to support the administrative work that an ESOP does entail? Because it's not just the transaction. ESOPs can be challenging to administer. Again, you've got a lot of people in the market that help with that tremendously and are very, very good at it, but they're not the most intuitive sometimes. Again, just even the idea that who's the owner of my company? Well, it's my retirement plan, and people kind of scratch their heads right off the bat. Well, there's a lot more than that. And also, I mean, the ESOP trustee will probably ask the key management to sign employment agreements with non-competes. So again, are they willing to go that far to sustain the transaction and to sustain or to establish, if you will, this culture of employee ownership?
Makes sense. Ken, let's assume a transaction goes through, and I'm going to use the 30% threshold from a tax perspective. So you end up selling 30% to the ESOP. Considerations, things that need to be looked at once that transaction is done, and some of the risks, the things that need to be on your radar. Let's exclude some of the basic administrative things, but what do people need to be looking at once that transaction is complete?
Well, you say exclude the administrative things. I think, when you're talking about a 30% transaction, I guess part of the issue that comes up is what is the relationship with the ESOP with the company, the ESOP trustee with the company? I'll say number one, do you keep an independent trustee? Then maybe that's your first question you have to deal with, because the independent trustee is critical for the transaction, not necessarily critical for the day-to-day administration and oversight of the ESOP. And a lot of ESOPs, once the transaction happens, go back to having somebody within the company or some executive team of the company serve as ESOP trustees. And for the most part, that's a little bit more administrative. Now, you have to recognize ESOP trustee is still a minority shareholder of the company. They have rights as a minority shareholder under state law. And they have obligations as an ESOP trustee to look out for the interests solely of the participants and beneficiaries of the plan. And so some of the things that come up over time are, what if the company wants to engage in a transaction that they know is going to be at least temporarily dilutive of value to the shares? How do we deal with that with the ESOP? And sometimes it's just, hey, that's the cost of doing business. And, again, if it doesn't create right of a shareholder to sue, there's really not much the ESOP trustee can do about it. If it's corporate waste, if it's, breach of fiduciary duties of loyalty or care, okay, we got issues. But for the most part, the company is free to do transactions. But, those governance issues in a minority position, they're lessened, that I would say they're even greater if it's a majority position, but greater issues to deal with. But the other thing is, if let's say you're an S Corp, then, part of the issue that comes up is when the, 70% owners of the company take their S Corp distributions, the ESOP gets its S Corp distribution. You have to keep those distributions equal. And what does the ESOP do with that money? Is it going to use it to repay the loan that it took? But there's that aspect of it you've got to keep in mind, is the ESOP is another shareholder. Just because those distributions to the ESOP are not taxable, because the ESOP is a tax exempt trust, doesn't mean you don't make them. Okay, so that's something else.
Then if we obviously debt servicing is a significant piece of this. If I'm the CFO, I got to imagine I'm also looking at the employees, and if employees, depending on when their anticipated retirement and so forth, you also have the payout of what they have earned on top of that, correct?
Yeah.
So cash flow and making sure you're able to.
Well, yeah, and from a company perspective, we didn't really get into the pros and cons of an ESOP for the company per se, but from a company perspective, that's one of the biggest concerns about ESOP, setting it up and sustainability is number one. Well, there's two aspects of it. One is the initial debt service to the selling shareholders or to the bank that financed the transaction in the first place. So maybe it's this 8 to 10 year bank loan or 8 to 10 year seller notes. And if it's a 30% transaction or 100%, whatever it is, that is debt on the books of the company, and it is a debt service that has to get paid, is true cash flow out the door. Okay, yep. So that is certainly something. In fact, one of the things we highly recommend in any ESOP transaction early on is that the company engage an independent advisor, and there's several of them, that would do a feasibility analysis to look at that debt service and how that impacts the company's financials over that period of time. But the second aspect of the cash flow, I'm not going to call it debt service, it's more the cash flow issue, is, I said before, ESOPs are 90+% invested in company stock. When a participant leaves the plan, they usually don't want to take the stock. Most of the time it's illiquid. Now, in some cases for C Corps, they can demand the stock and put it back to the company within so much time. If they think the stock is going to go way up next year, okay, they might take that chance. But at the end of the day, the company's got to come up with the cash somehow. And so well-run ESOPs, they engage in what's called a repurchase obligation study, an RO study, that looks ahead, who's retiring, who's likely to leave, what are their accounts, how much cash are we going to need to get there, and plan for that. And there's ways you can pre-fund that cash. There's ways you can, and it sounds bad, and I say manipulate, I'll say manage your distribution options, okay? Yep. In terms of, if let's say somebody is a retiree, well, maybe you allow your retirees to take lump sums immediately, but anybody who's not a retiree, you say you're going to wait 5 years and you're going to take installments unless your account is less than this dollar. So there's ways to manage the cash flow if you are forecasting well. But I've seen both sides of that. I've seen it where it's been done very, very well, and it's not really a drain on the company because they've planned for it, and some where all of a sudden the spike hits and there's been no strategizing and the company is really, really hurting for a period of time.
Yep, makes sense. Ken, can you talk about an instance where an ESOP was used as a mean of succession planning successfully?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's several that I've worked with. One that was fairly recent. It was in the last 5 years or so. Two brothers owned the company that was founded by their father. They had tried to sell the company. It wasn't a large company. It was, in the construction industry. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of at the beginning of COVID, so they were actually doing very well, because a lot of people were staying home and building onto their homes, and the company had a huge increase in profits. Of course, this was that hockey stick situation, right? Where they had 4 or 5 years of history was pretty stable, and all of a sudden a year and a half where things took off. And the ESOP trustee wasn't valuing on that year and a half. It was factored in, but not on like a 5-year EBITDA multiple. Yeah. And so, the trustee also wanted some clawback in case the company performance went down, and measured over a multi-year period. And we negotiated in, okay, well, if you want a clawback, we want an earnout. And I don't think that's done very often at ESOP transactions, to be, perfectly honest. But we negotiated that because we wanted to say, no, this value is sustainable. It should, we fully expect it will be, this will be our new norm. And the earnout was actually about double the clawback amount. Right. And at the end of the day, it was fully earned. So, it was really, really good. The brothers have now retired, and they got not only the closing price value, they got the full earnout. Now, they're getting paid out over a 10-year period, but those notes got re-amortized. And, that I think is a really good
and Ken, was that 100%
success story. It was 0. Yeah, it was 0 to 100. It was 0 to 100. We recently did a second stage ESOP transaction, where the first stage we did it about 10 years ago, a 30% transaction, or 35 or something like that. And the owners did their 1042 rollover. Corporation was a C Corp. Yep. And then they did the 100%. It ended up being a single owner doing a 100% transaction. And, those are tricky, to be perfectly honest, because one of the things you have to address in those transactions is how does the transaction itself impact your current ESOP participants? Because they're going along with a certain valuation, and suddenly the company takes on all the debt that would drop the value of their shares.
Yes.
And so, in that instance, the trustee asked for and received some floor price protection for the ESOP participants, those who are nearing retirement or who are getting installments after retirement, or in pay status, I should say. They were guaranteed a certain minimum payout amount, even though that was higher than the actual fair market value of the shares.
Sure. Makes
So,
sense.
yeah.
There are a lot of options. I think one of the things to recognize is obviously there's a lot of administrative work that goes into this, but it really provides a lot of flexibility for families who are looking to create liquidity and maintain a lot of that potentially control and the culture of the organization, the legacy that they built.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's one of the things that, these long-term ESOPs that are run well, you truly see that. You see the legacy that the family is still kind of honored, if you will, by the employees, because now they've recognized that, hey, we've become the owners of the company now. And I've seen that success story on the side, not just in the transactional side, but the long-term ESOP side, where the ESOP not only engaged in a transaction years ago, but then they have to do new transactions to basically re-leverage the shares, get a new pool ready to be allocated, and just continue that sustainability over time. One company we work with that's had an ESOP for probably 30 plus years. I don't remember exactly when. I thought it was in the 80s that they established it. 100% ESOP owned, S corporation, and you're having these career folks there, not executives, but just people who've been there 30, 40 years working on the floor, working in more clerical positions, so on, retiring as millionaires just from their ESOP account. That's probably a little unusual of a story, but you've seen that work, and tremendous benefit on that.
I love it.
One other thing I was going to say, and we didn't touch on this, but I just want to make sure we mention it, because it's an S corp. Keep in mind that the taxes that would normally be paid by not the corporation, because it passes through the shareholder, the taxes that would normally be paid by the shareholder don't get paid by the ESOP, because the ESOP is a tax exempt trust. So all of those amounts flow through to the participant valuations.
Yes.
Taxes get paid eventually when the participants take a distribution, but it can be a decades-long tax deferral.
Which is great. Huge advantage.
Huge advantage to the company, huge advantage to the participants to get that value.
Yep, I love it. Ken, last thoughts, advice, things that you're like, you got to think about this if somebody is considering this.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's probably get some good independent advice, and by that I mean there's a lot of places out there that promote ESOPs, and I think they do a great job. Okay, but that is that's their trade. Their trade is you have certain associations or different groups that really promote all the positives, and there are a lot, but keep in mind some of the challenges as well. So go into it with open eyes. Get that independent advice. And, I kind of joke when it comes to ESOPs, I've probably talked more business owners out of an ESOP than actually have gone through an ESOP. but I think that's not a bad thing, because there are a lot of other liquidity options to consider. This is one. It may be a good fit. Sometimes you realize it's not, and you have to be realistic about that. The second thing I would say is, one thing that we've seen over the years, and I don't like it, is that many times selling shareholders think, we've got company counsel, we're good. Who's representing the selling shareholder in this transaction? And it seems like, okay, well, aren't all the interests aligned? 90% of the time they are. but I'll give you an example where it might not be. So I said before, a lot of these ESOP transactions are financed by simply the company issuing seller notes to the selling shareholders, 10 years at X%. And many times the trustee is the one who proposes the terms to the company of what length of a note they want and what percentage they're prepared to authorize the company to pay. Now, if a trustee comes to me and I'm company counsel and they say, we want a 15-year note at 6%. First of all, there's nowhere close to market, but they say that, okay? I'm company counsel, I'm fine. I'm not going to try to negotiate that to 8% or 10% or 8 years, because that hurts the company.
Correct.
Selling shareholder might want to negotiate that independently and get representation on that front. So there's that dichotomy. Another situation we had years ago where we got involved as brought in as counsel to the selling shareholder a month before close, maybe less than that, before closing. And this was an S corp where it had a large AAA account, had been, money had been taxed. And the ESOP trustee was basically going to pay the value of that amount as part of the purchase price proceeds, taxable purchase price. And we came in and said, strip out the AAA account.
That's right.
Just take the cash, lower the purchase price. You'll end up with the same dollars, but you're not pay tax on this. We probably saved the guy close to $1 million in tax. He didn't have representation up to that point. Nobody was looking out for his interests specifically. And, that was one of those situations where just, again, it reinforced to me the idea that selling shareholders really should think about getting independent counsel. Again, adds transaction costs, adds complexity. Sometimes I regret saying that because the selling shareholders counsel adds all these things that we can't, we're never going to get that approved. But that I think that's a good thing, to again, fully negotiated transaction that is, when you look at it from an objective point of view, it's fair, it's arm's length, everybody's interests, were protected, and so on.
I'm going to put in a plug here for those who watch this webinar that reach out to Ken. There are a lot of nuances to ESOPs, and if your counsel doesn't understand them, you need to find counsel that does. And there are a lot of nuances. There are risks, but there's also rewards, but you have to understand all the details. So while I normally don't plug organizations and people, I'm gonna do it now because I think it's really important, and there's a ton of value in that, even though you may have higher transaction costs.
And one last thing I'll say, Josh, one of the reasons I love working with ESOPs is because unlike a lot of M&A transactions, let's say, we're engaged with a company that the selling shareholders are selling the business. Once the closing happens, we're done. That relationship is pretty much over. In an ESOP transaction, in many cases, that relationship is just beginning. And that's pretty cool because it's not very often you can say, yes, I helped a client sell their business, or I helped this business get sold. And by the way, now we're corporate counsel, or, we're ESOP counsel, and it's just really neat to see how you get to see how it worked. At the end of the day. And in a lot of cases, you don't get to do that. And that to me is pretty special.
That's fantastic. Ken, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us here at Family.Inc. I would encourage you to check out the website, where we have more videos and resources for enterprising families. And after this webinar, you'll receive a survey asking for your feedback. We'd love your perspective so we can develop better content. With that, have a great day. Have a fantastic rest of your week. And thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.